Thanks, Cody. Thank you. Well, I hope I can live up to my billing. So, women's lives in Chosun Korea. If you can't hear me in the back, please let me know. I'm going to wander around when I talk. It keeps me awake. I think for me this is always a fun topic to talk about. And I remember when I was a graduate student and I went to study in Korea at Seoul National University, and I was in the history department. And one of the professors, my advisor, I won't say who because he's still there, and he asked me, what do you want to study? And I said, I'd like to study about two things. One is shamanism, and the other is women. And he looked at me, and he kind of shook his head, and he says, well, why don't you study something interesting? And, and so I studied something interesting while I was there. But it wasn't necessarily about women. And the problem was, I think, in the time period when I was studying, that scholarship in Korea was pretty much dominated by men who had come up, I guess, in the 60s, 50s and 60s after the colonial period, and they were trying to do the orthodox Korean history and to establish it as it should be, I guess, on par with Japan and China. And they really didn't have time to talk about women, which is okay, I suppose, because it left me a field that no one else was doing anything with for a long time. Of course, that's changed in the last 20 years. Now we have lots and lots of good scholarship coming out of Korea, done by women, looking at not just women, but done mostly by women, looking at women in Korean history and trying to redefine what we know about them. We don't have to believe everything we were told, basically. And I guess that's where I start from. If I can figure out how to do this, there we go, I can. I got basically three things that I'd like to talk about here. First is to kind of examine Confucianism. First of all, look at Confucianism and see how that changed women's lives in the transition from the Goryeo Dynasty to the Chosǒn Dynasty. What happened in that period in the 14th century and forward. Second, I'd like to listen to what women had to say about their own lives. Rather than relying on sources that were written by males, let's read what women wrote about their own lives in the Chosǒn Dynasty. That's probably the best way to know what's going on in that period. And finally, this is actually my newest project, is to explore women's economic activities and to see if there's some correlation between economic activities and autonomy, success in life, so on and so forth. But basically, that's what I have here. But first, we'll start with Confucianism because that's fun. So let's talk about women in life before the Chosǒn Dynasty. We start off with whenever Korean history started, whenever that might have been, and we build up to this time. What do we know about native Korean customs? What did Koreans do before Confucianism came into the dynasty? What do we know about women's lives? Well, the first thing I think that's really important is that Korea was quite certainly, scholarship will tell us, it was a matrilineal society. It wasn't based on a patriarchal system at all. It was based on the mother's line. Now, I'm not saying it was a matriarchy. It was not. There's no evidence that that was the case at all. But it was certainly matrilineal. It was based on the woman's descent line. How do we know that? We know it through various records that date back into the Goryeo Dynasty. And they tell us that when men and women married, where did they live? It wasn't 시집가요. They went to the woman's house. It was the opposite. So they're not living at the male's house, at the home of the husband, but rather they're living at the home of the wife. And how long did they live there? Not 3 days, not a week, not 5 days. According to Lee Gyu-bo, who was a well-known poet, scholar, whatever, of the 13th century, he says that they lived there long enough to have grandchildren. So they pretty much spent their whole lives at the woman's home. Now, what does that matter? What does it matter in the larger scheme of things? Well, I think if we look at it, that the husband was coming into the woman's home as a guest. She was in her familiar surroundings. She was with her family. She was with her siblings, her parents, her servants, etc. He came over there. He had to walk on eggshells, essentially. He wasn't the one wielding power. I don't think so. He was doing what he should do to support his wife within her household. So it meant that the woman possessed a lot of, well, power is one word for it, I suppose, but a lot of wherewithal to do what she wanted to do. she had a little bit of something behind her. So we go from matrilineal society. What else do we know about native Korean customs? And I do have problems using the word Korea here, but I have to use something, okay? There was no Korea in this period, but we can say the peninsula, the Rabbit Peninsula, what was happening there. The community was very important. The community was the most important thing. If we think back into the times of the Three Kingdoms period with all the battles, the wars and whatnot, all these things going on into the Koryo dynasty, you have established kingdoms, you have established governments, but to the average person, they really didn't care. None of this mattered. What mattered was the people that were around them. If they were going to survive, if they were going to have enough food to eat, if they were going to be able to be successful, they needed their fellows, the people in their community, to be there with them. And so we have very elaborate systems of labor sharing developed early in Korean history. And one such example is the dure, where people would come together and help do labor on a reciprocal basis. So they're not working just on their property at their home, they're working at various different places, and they're working as a team. Why is that a good thing? Well, working with other people helps move the process along. It makes it easier. It allows people to share bonds, to talk, to enjoy themselves while they're working. In the case of women, we have a couple of different types of dure that were specific to women. One of them is for kimjang, for making kimchi in the fall. This goes back quite a way in Korean history, that people would get together, women folk would get together to make kimchi. And why is that important? Well, they could share recipes, so you can find out how to make tasty kimchi from your neighbor. Something along those lines would be important. Also for weaving, to create cloth, to make cloth. So women would work together to do this as well. So the community and labor sharing was very important. And finally then, going back to this, the native custom is women's rights to property and inheritance. Women had economic wherewithal before the Chosǒn Dynasty. They could inherit property, slaves, whatever, land, money, and that gives them the same thing that it gives anybody today. If you have money, if you have economic power, you don't have to put up with a lot of abuse from anybody, do you? You can take your money and go home or throw that person out. And that's important, because once you cut that off, then all of a sudden you don't have that ability. Relative equality between men and women. I'm not saying it was equal, relatively. We do have records, of course, of queens, of female monarchs in the Shilla Kingdom. There was a TV series about one of them, right? Sondok? Yeah. Yeah, so we have some of these things that, and I doubt that anything in the TV series was true, but nonetheless, we know that there were queens that had the ability to run the state. We also know that there were power brokers, women who were power brokers in the royal court, and I give the example of Queen Mother Hune in the 10th century. She ran the Koryo dynasty for a number of years there and manipulated her son to get things done. Again, women had relative equality. They weren't equal 100%, but relatively. I suppose this is where we have to start from. Oh, by the way, if you have questions, feel free to interrupt me. It'll be just like my classes when my students don't know what I'm talking about and have a question and they, Professor Pettid, what are you talking about? That's fine. Go ahead and just ask me, okay? Okay, Confucianism and change for Korea. Why change? Korea had a great society, I think, in the Koryo period. Society worked pretty good. They had Koryo had actually an attitude towards the world that was impressive. They didn't necessarily look at China as being the great. They didn't adhere to this idea of sade, of serving the great. Koryo saw itself as an equal with China. It saw itself as an equal at times. Of course, there were problems with that. And the biggest problem was when the Mongols invaded and insisted that they weren't equal anymore, and they weren't equal with the Mongol Empire. And so there was a lot of bad things happening in Koryo in terms of the power structure and the way things had disintegrated in those terms. So why change? Well, Confucianism is an attractive ideology for ruling. It is a system simply to administer a state, first and foremost. It's built on the ideas that the home is structured in a certain way, and that transfers to society the same way. The same way that we serve our father, well, we serve the king. It transfers quite nicely. It's a very hierarchical system, and it keeps people in place. So in terms of ruling the state, for the ruling classes to look at something like this, this is wonderful. We have a hierarchy that puts everyone where they belong, and I'm on top. What could be better if you were the king running the state? So as a ruling ideology, it's much more logical than Buddhism. Buddhism's attacked for being antisocial, for having all these problems. Whether or not that's true, it doesn't really matter, but it's perception. Confucianism worked. Probably more important is the second one. It's an excuse. And Isongge and the people that backed him when he founded the new dynasty needed an excuse for getting rid of Koryo. We can't just throw out the king. That's not being loyal, right? That's one of the samgang. You can't throw out the bond of loyalty by any means. So we need to have an excuse for doing this. So Koryo was corrupt. Why is Koryo corrupt? Koryo's corrupt because of Buddhism, plain and simple. So if we can make that correlation, then we can justify turning over the dynasty. And this is what happened. That's how Chosǒn, Isongge, and the people that backed him were able to put in this new dynasty in place. It also was following the lead of the Ming, of the Ming dynasty in China. To the Confucianists in the late Koryo and the early Chosǒn period, the Ming was the center of the world. It was a Han Chinese dynasty. It was extending back to the great dynasties before the Yuan, before Tang, but back to the Han dynasty. And it was a way to follow that lead, something that they saw as being the center of the world. So that was good, I suppose. Solidify power bases. If you're able to arrange a society based on Confucianism, then one, the person that was doing this, that was creating this system, was able to solidify their power base. Take out the Buddhist temples, take out the Buddhist establishment, take out the people that had been in collaboration with the Yuan, and we're able to establish our strongholds within society. So it's a good way for the people that were in power with Isongge to solidify their power base. And finally, this idea of creating a Confucian utopia was probably in their mind as well. And this is going to be small at the beginning of the dynasty, but by the time we have the fall of the Ming and the rise of the Qing in China, then this becomes the focal point of Korea. Because once China is no longer ruled by the Han people, now it's ruled by barbarians. Who is the real Confucian country? Well, it was Chosǒn. And so 17th century for Chosǒn, this becomes very, very important that they are the ones that are preserving the beauty of Confucianism. But of course, like with anything else, there's points of conflict with Confucianism and native Korean custom. And the first of these, first and foremost, is the fact that it's a Chinese-based worldview. It's not a Korean worldview. It's different than Buddhism. Buddhism changed a lot when it came into Korea. It melded with shamanism. It had lots of things that appealed to the people. On the other hand, Confucianism is fairly much a foreign ideology. It comes in there and it's being forced on the people. So number one, it reflects Chinese custom. It doesn't reflect Korean custom. And this is a big thing. We'll talk a little bit about this in a while, but Korea's own customs were quite distinct from those of China. And this is, of course, for everyone in here, you know this. But sometimes if I'm talking to people that don't know much about Asia, and I say that, they're surprised to hear that China and Korea and Japan actually have different customs. They're not the same. Well, very true in this case. Next, it's a patriarchal system. Again, this is reflective of Chinese-based worldview. China had been a patriarchy for a long, 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 long time. No doubt about that. And Confucianism supported that patriarchal system. Well, Koryo may have had patriarchal aspects, but it wasn't a patriarchal society in the sense that China was. It was a matrilineal society. So there's going to be lots of conflicts when you're trying to enforce customs that reflect Chinese customs with what's in Korea. And this is what happens. So the patriarchal system is very big. And finally, customs aren't easily changed. I think everybody knows this, right? It's very hard to change customs. Life is difficult to change. And life is difficult to change because we learn about what we do and what we believe in from our parents and our grandparents. And that reflects something that's passed down to us from them. That's how we learn. If the government came around tomorrow and told us we're going to do X, Y, and Z, it would take a long time to soak into this country or any other country because we do what we grew up doing. That's how the world works, I think. It certainly worked that way in Korea. So there's our little points. Let's talk about women specifically now. The changes in women's lives. It's not a big event from 1392. The world didn't change in 1392 when the Chosǒn Dynasty was founded. It took centuries. It took a long, long time because, again, customs are difficult to change. And I suppose women probably didn't want to change customs. If you started the Chosǒn Dynasty in 1392, if the first king had issued a decree saying that women could no longer inherit property, that they could no longer, what else can't they do? They can no longer remarry, things like this. The women would have been up in arms. There would have been a revolt, and Isongye would not have gone very far as the king. Change has to be gradual. It has to be so gradual that you don't even know it's changing, and that's the key. So it took centuries. It took a long time, a little bit at a time. You legislate from the top down. It takes a long time for anything to happen. By the time things happen, people don't actually realize that they're losing out on something. Legislation is the key. The Chosǒn Dynasty was very, very good about putting forth legal codes, dozens of legal codes throughout the dynasty in order to legislate things. And legal codes actually are one of the most interesting aspects of Korean history, I think. Not that I care much for that sort of things, laws perhaps, but if you want to know what was wrong, what was the hot topic in the Chosǒn Dynasty at any particular time, all you have to do is look to the legal codes. What sort of laws are being pushed forward? That tells us where the points of conflict were. If people were accepting these things, handout, you don't need laws. You need laws because people aren't doing it. So the legal code's really important in this aspect. This, the bottom part here, the Neue Pulp, isn't actually a law. It's just the term that's given to all this. The rules of the inner and the outer. The women are the inner, the men are the outer, right? Women stay at home, men go to work. That's the idea. But this whole body of legislation, social customs, whatnot, is kind of grouped together under this idea of the Neue Pulp here. So other distinctions here. First, the difference between upper status and lower status women. This is very important. One of the things that needs to be emphasized is the Chosǒn Dynasty was 518 years long. It lasted from 1392 to 1910. Chosŏn Korea in 1393 is in no way like Chosŏn Korea in 1705 or in 1805 or in 1905. Just like our society today, Chosŏn was quite dynamic. It changed a lot. It wasn't stagnant. It wasn't a hermit kingdom. It wasn't backwards. All these things are wrong. Chosŏn changed a lot, and it changed all the time. It was regular and ongoing. So we can't talk about the Chosŏn Dynasty as a unified whole. It just doesn't exist, okay? Any more than we can talk about China as a unified whole from the Ming through the Qing, roughly the same period. The same point can be made for women. You cannot talk about women in the Chosŏn Dynasty. Whoever wrote the title on this thing for me is entirely wrong. How can you talk about Chosŏn women? Because there is not a Chosŏn woman. There are lots of women in the Chosŏn Dynasty, just like there is today. And not everyone was the same. They had different backgrounds. They had different economic abilities. They had different education. They had different social systems. All these things were different. So we can't really talk about these people as being any sort of unified whole. But what we can talk about, I guess, is upper status and lower status as a beginning point. Upper status women, I don't like to use class because it sounds like Marxist theory, and that doesn't really apply to Korea in the 14th century. But upper status women would have been those who had some connections with the political power of the day. Maybe they were of the Yangban status, maybe they weren't, but nonetheless they had some sort of power there. Lower status, I think, is easier to define. It would have been the peasants, it would have been the commoners, would have been the slaves of the Chosŏn Dynasty. There's a great gulf between these two groups of women. So what happens? We have a gradual erosion of the rights that women had held heretofore. And it starts off, with things like inheritance. You take away the ability to inherit property, wealth, slaves, and all of a sudden the woman's not as strong as she used to be. She doesn't have that power. In the Kōryo dynasty, I should bring remarriage up with the same thing. These actually go hand in hand. In the Kōryo dynasty, women remarried a lot. They were encouraged to remarry. Women who were wealthy were seen as good catches. They had lots of money, so people wanted to marry them. Lots of women remarried into the royal family of the Kōryo dynasty. So they were seen as attractive wives. It wasn't seen as some sort of social stigma. Their husband might have died. Who knows? It doesn't matter. She's young, she has money, she's a good wife. And this is the way that they were looked at in the Kōryo dynasty. But this is going to change when we get into the Chosǒn dynasty. They're going to prohibit this. How are they able to prohibit this? Well, take away their money. They don't have the economic wherewithal. What can they do but do what they're told? Stay at the home of their husband and stay there. They don't have the ability to go out on their own. So this is very important. These two things go together. Remarriage itself was an affront to Confucianism, of course. Marriage isn't an item like it is today, where you find somebody and you marry them because you look in their eyes and you want to live happily ever after. It's not that sort of situation at all. In the Chosǒn dynasty, marriage was about families. Families married. We marry not necessarily to make our children happy, but to create political alliances, social connections, and whatnot. So marriage was that sort of deal. So when you married for life, because once you married, you were into that family. You belonged to that family, so you were located there. So to remarry would be to break that bond, and that's the part that's not acceptable, I think, in the Chosǒn dynasty. To be a householder, this even comes later, 18th century, when women aren't allowed to be the head of the house anymore, to be the legal head of the house. And for those of you that are my age, you probably know that until 10 years, what has it been, 10 years in South Korea when women have again been able to be the householder? It took that long for women to have that legislated, that part of the law to come back in where women could actually be in charge of their own house, right? So they're not getting crossed off anymore like they used to. So this is important. And finally, this last one, the induction into one's affines home or into the husband's house was a way to attack the matrilineal nature of Korean society. So instead of having the husband and wife live at the wife's home, now we're going to live at the husband's home. And the debate, of course, throughout the Chosǒn dynasty, and they were never successful in doing this 100%, was how long should they stay in the bride's home? How many days? And finally, they get it down to 2-3 days, right? You can stay that long. We'll have the marriage there. You spend the night, spend another night, and then you're out. And don't come back. You know, you can come back once a year, and only the wife, right? So this was very important that they were able to do this. So they're taking the essence of Korean culture, the matrilineal line, and they're throwing that out, and they're replacing it with a patriarchal system, so the patrilineal system. These are big changes, but it took a long, long time. It didn't happen overnight. Well, and then we have other things crop up that are always interesting to look at. We have the 7 grounds for divorce. These actually date to Tang, the Tang dynasty. They're not new. But in the Kōryo dynasty, you could never enforce these. If a woman had money and her husband said, I'm going to divorce you because you talk too much, what do you think that woman would have said? I'm going to take my money and go find a better guy than you. It just wouldn't hold, right? It's just something that would have been impossible. But once you strip away that economic power, now all of a sudden you can force people to do things. You can use this. You can hang it over someone's head. It's a club. Anyway, the 7 grounds for divorce, I actually have them written so I don't have to remember them. Jealousy, adultery, talkativeness, failing to serve one in-law, chronic illness, failure to bear a son, and theft. You know, it's good stuff, right? In the Kōryo dynasty, women could divorce their husbands under certain conditions, just like a man could divorce his wife. So they had equality in that sense that they could both do that. In the Chosǒn Dynasty, that's over with. Now, when could something like this be enforced? Well, it could be enforced when there was a situation where the husband wanted some sort of change and his family had the status, political status, economic status, that they were able to do it above the wife's family. If the wife's family was very powerful, I don't think you'd see that enacted. So it was kind of, but it was there anyway. You don't have a son. I think this is the one that comes back most, that we talk about the most, is failure to bear a son. After all, we had a queen that was thrown out for not having a son, right? And a concubine came in for a brief period in the 18th century. So this is one, failure to bear a son, and the other is jealousy, of course, and we'll talk why jealousy is important in just a minute. Well, we'll talk about it now. Because we have primary and secondary wives, we have two senses. You can't be jealous. I'm going to have a concubine. You're not allowed to be jealous. That's a ground for divorce. These sort of things, you know, you look at them in this sense, and you can see that where they would have created points of friction. There's an interesting story from the Goryeo dynasty when one of the couriers came back from Song, China, and he talked about how wonderful life was in China for the ministers of the royal court because they could have several wives, and how wonderful that would be, and how Korean men should be able to enjoy this same sort of thing, to have multiple wives. Well, evidently the word of this got back to his wife, and his wife showed up at the royal court and with other wives and caused quite a stir, and they dropped the idea. You know, it was like, okay, well, never mind. We're not China. We're Korea. We're Goryeo. We don't want to do this. And so it caused a problem there for that. But in the Chosǒn Dynasty, this isn't going to happen anymore. If you had the economic ability to have a secondary wife, you could have a concubine. So we can't have jealousy between the two. So why didn't women just say, I'm not doing this? It would have been, today, if you tried to enact stuff like this, I'm fairly sure women would say, we're not doing this. You can do it if you want to, but we're not doing it. Well, if you think about society as Chosǒn moves on, I'm not talking about the 14th century, I'm not talking about the 15th century, I'm talking about the 16th century and beyond, Confucianism becomes this ideal, the thing that every upper status family is striving for. Pass the examination, go into government service, and have some sort of political power and wealth that goes along with it. It's a way to support our ancestors, a way to shine glory on our lineage, all these great things. Confucianism becomes the most important social system within Chosǒn society. There's really nothing else. It'd be just like today in the United States if you decided that you didn't want to adhere to capitalism anymore. I don't want to be a capitalist. I'm going to go live in upstate New York and have a commune, and we're going to grow corn. Yeah, right. You know, if you didn't have money to buy the land, if you didn't have the tax money and all these things, it's never going to happen. They would arrest you and put you in jail, right? It's just not going to happen. Just like in the Chosǒn Dynasty, if you wanted to succeed, and nobody wants to go into life and fail, and it's not just about me, it's about my family, it's about my parents, it's about my children. So what am I supposed to do? I'm going to do the best I can to see that my family does well and my children do well. How do I do that? I have to follow Confucianism, at least on some level. And this is what happens. So after a period of centuries, Confucianism becomes an expedient, a way to join proper society, and people follow it for that reason. Do they follow it 100%? No way. But do they follow it? Yes, they do. So there's penalties for non-compliance. Of course, there's laws. You can't break the laws. If a woman was to remarry, it didn't really hurt her. Who did it hurt? It hurt her sons. They weren't eligible to sit for the government service exam for 2 generations. So that ruined her family if she was to remarry. So she doesn't remarry because she necessarily believes that it's a bad thing, but she doesn't want to ruin her children's lives. And this makes good sense. There are other laws like this. And finally, social disadvantages. You can't, if you don't behave yourself properly, you just can't get along in society, just like today, just like in the 16th century. So this was the issue here. So what was negative about Confucianism for women? Everything I just said. But in addition to that, we have some other stuff. Finally, you know, just simply put, if you've read the Analects, if you've read Mencius, if you've read these books, it's very evident that Confucius and Mencius didn't see women as being equals with men. Confucius, one of his famous utterances is that women are not to be relied upon. Why? Because of their what is it, yin nature. I'm trying to get confused in Korean and Chinese here. They were too yin. They couldn't, there we go, that's Korean, I get it right. They couldn't be trusted because their temperament was dictated by yin qualities or qualities. So they couldn't be trusted to do things within official society. So Confucius gives an example of a woman who told her husband, a king, what to do. The man follows her, and of course he fails, right? So don't listen to your wives, right? So just basically, Confucianism does not value women as much as men, okay? Basically, I think, fundamentally. Next, that's Confucianism. Then we have all this social education that's biased in favor of women. And it's little things that you hear when you're growing up. It's not anything that's legislated. It's nothing that's necessarily everybody hears, but people hear it. And you hear something long enough, you start believing it, right? And so, you know, your grandfather tells you something like "남존 여비." And you, oh, really? Men are here, women are there. Okay, I can. Why? Why, Grandpa? He has nothing to say. Punechon, man is heaven. Sure they are. Sure they are. Yopil Jonggu, a woman must follow her husband. There's all sorts of these in Korean society. So you hear these long enough as a little girl growing up, and you start to internalize them at some level. You start to believe these things. I think more common examples would be, and this is something that I don't think is, maybe it still happens, I hope not. You're sitting at the table, you're eating with your family, and grandma gives the little boy a really tasty piece of gogi, of meat, to eat, right? Here you go, have that. She doesn't give it to the daughter, right? She gives it to the boy. You need this so you can grow up to be strong. Little things like this kind of create that friction. When I first came to Korea 30 years ago, I remember that when men had daughters, people would actually offer their condolences. It was their first, oh, 죄송해요. You know, why? Why? But I mean, that was 30 years ago, and these were old men, right? It doesn't happen anymore, I know. But these sort of things are the way that people are brought into the world. And once again, customs, the things you learn from your parents are the things that you carry with you. And I think in this case, this is one example of it anyway. So women have to do something with this. They have to figure out how to deal with Confucianism. You know, what are we going to do with it? We need to have some way to spread this out to people, to understand what we're doing, to make it ours, if you would. And the first effort, I think, is this book written in 1475 called Nehun. And it really isn't an original book. Queen Sohei actually took stuff out of Chinese books that she liked and put it in her book. This is plagiarizing today. You can't do that without footnotes. Anyway, she did it, and this was published, and it was set forth. And it was a way to spread the ideas of Confucianism to the upper status, to the queens, to the royals, to the upper status, the ministers' wives, the yangban, these groups. That's the first attempt, because number one, you have to be literate to read this, right? And the Nehun's written in mixed script. So that means there's Hanmun, there's Chinese characters, and there's Hangul, in a way. It's not very good Hangul. It's just Hangul, okay? But it's a mixed script, so it could have been read by a lot of people, I think. Anyway, one of the things she says here is she talks about these 4 beautiful womanly virtues, and I like this. Being a virtuous wife, correct speech, proper skills, and fostering merit. That's what a woman should do. How benign. You won't hurt anyone if you do that. You're out of the way. It's simple to do. Don't speak too loudly, so nicely, stay at home, do things like that. That's what you should do. And of course, this is wonderful if you're a queen. I suppose you can do this. But if you're an actual person that has to work or make sure your family survives, maybe you can't do this. But anyway, these were the first attempts to educate women about Confucianism. And so Sohei's book was the first one. So, things to remember. The change was gradual and never complete. This is really important. We hear about things like the Confucianization of Korea, the Confucian transformation of Korea. Sorry, Martina. I shouldn't say this. But nonetheless, it didn't really happen. I think that's what we have to be aware of. There was this push by the ruling class to create a Confucian society. But just because the ruling class is pushing something doesn't mean it happens. There's always a disconnect between A and B. I think the problem with this is at some point we took their word for it, that it happened. We read the dynastic records, the Chosǒn Wangzhou we read it, and we believed what it said in there, that the country's doing this, that the people are doing this. What we didn't do was actually go back and look at the people and ask them what they were doing. Of course, they're dead, but we can read their writings and find out what happened. And that's the problem with a lot of the early scholarship, I think, on Korean history, is that we didn't actually go back and look harder and find alternative source materials. Not something published by the government, something edited and then published by the government. Not that, but let's look at what they actually wrote. And when you actually look at the writings of what people talked about, what they saw, what they said, it's much different. And that's the disconnect, okay? So whatever people said, it didn't happen. Not 100%. I don't know the percentage, but it didn't happen to that degree. And women weren't going to give up their rights that easily. Women weren't going to do that. Korean women are very, very forceful when they want to be. My wife's Korean, I can say this. Korean women don't like to be told what to do, right? Can I just leave that at that? It took a long time to make things happen like this. Okay, so there's a lot of push, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it happened. And second, it was a top-down affair. So the upper classes had some incentive to adopt this. The lower classes had none. They could care less. They want to eat. They want food. They don't care about decorum or something like this. It doesn't matter to them. So we have to always think about it in terms of social status on how this affected people, because there was quite a difference between the two. I think we're ready to talk. Nope, no, we're not. Finally, women never completely adhered. And this is the interesting part. And this is when we did this last volume that Cody mentioned on women in Confucianism, and I forget the title. Anyway, in Chosǒn, something like that. When we did this book, it was really interesting to find the ways. We set out looking at ways that women were able to get around, basically, Confucianism, how they actually lived with it, how they managed with it. And it's amazing the ways that they were able to do it. They did it in the sense that they simply said they did it and they didn't do it. That's the easiest, right? Well, of course I do that. And then they do whatever they want to do. They made up social customs to go around it, remarriage, for example. They were able to get around that. Educational texts changed from something that was, like I mentioned with the Nehun, that was written trying to drop this down to something to teach women how to actually debate with men about Confucianism. So now we can say, oh, no. That's not what Confucius said, honey, and move on from there. So there was a way to do that. So there were areas that they kept, that women kept, where Confucian dictates didn't apply. And this is important. So there were spaces for women where they could do what they wanted to do. I mean, one of the biggest policies of Confucianism when it came into the Chosǒn Dynasty was the suppression of Buddhism and Shamanism, to get rid of them. And if I'm not mistaken, Buddhism was quite strong in 19th century Korea, as was Shamanism. They went nowhere. Despite all the legislation, despite all the effort the government put to get rid of them, they didn't go anywhere. Why didn't they go anywhere? Because they had a lot of function and a lot of use, and not just to women. But I mean, this is just one example. So it's not necessarily what people say they do, it's what they actually do. And finally, the last one here now. Women learned about Confucianism and used it to their advantage, and I think this is important. So they learned about Confucianism, how to manipulate it, how to talk about it, and they were able to use this to their advantage with their husband, with their family. Now I think I'm ready to talk about something different. There we go, women in literature. I don't have my, make sure I'm doing here on time. All right, I'm good. So, why literature? Literature is how we can look at women and see what they actually had to say about it. So, most of the stuff we read in history is written by men, by upper status men at that. Not just any man, but a man of upper status, of means, of some social standing, I suppose. And what he says about women isn't necessarily what women actually did. So the best way to find out about women, in my opinion, is to ask them. And since we can't ask the women that have been dead for 300, 400, 500 years, we can look at what they wrote and what they left us. And this helps us understand what they actually believed, what they actually thought, what they wanted to do, and so on. So we begin with oral literary forms. And these are difficult to nail down because if they're orally transmitted, then they'd have to be translated for centuries before they got written down. But there's actually examples of this. There are cases of things that have been transmitted for years and years and years. And among these, I would say the shaman songs are very important. Shaman songs shamanism itself was from the Chosǒn Dynasty forward, probably primarily managed by women. It became their domain. Not exclusively. It's not like they wouldn't let men in, but men had other places they could go for their needs. So women kind of managed this. So they created songs that reflect what they saw, what they felt was needed to be said. Folk tales, popular songs. The creation of Hangul is very important. It wasn't created so people could write stories. It wasn't created for that. It was created so the government could educate people about Confucianism, okay? That's fundamentally what it did. It was to educate people about Confucianism. But it's just like Pandora's box. Once you open it up, you can't put it back in there. And once people had this system that they could write down anything they wanted, you can learn Hangul. How long did it take you to learn the alphabet in Korea? Yeah. You were slow. Yeah, that's all it takes. It's easy. Imagine if you spoke Korean and you had that. It'd be wonderful. I could write down anything I want to say. And that's how it functioned. It was just as soon as it was out there, people could do what they needed to do with it very easily. And then there's writings in Hanmun. And women wrote in Hanmun as well. Okay, it's not just men. So there's these different writings, different forms. Anyway, literature gives us a space for creative endeavors and alternative realities. And both these are important. It's a way to envision something that you can't necessarily do in life. And so you can write a story that allows you to get some sort of vicarious satisfaction that you can do something in here. And reading works the same way. Let's look at some other stuff here. So let's talk about some popular songs. And these songs are, songs that were transmitted orally for many, many years. And then finally, when Hangul's created in the 15th century, they're finally written down. So they survived for 200 or 300 years, which is pretty impressive, actually. I wonder how many of the songs that are playing today in Korea will be around 300 years from now. I don't think a lot of them. I don't think so. Anyway, numerous pre-Chosǒn songs, this is Koryo period, reflect the lives of women. And the one I want to talk about is Kashiri, which is a nice little song. And we're just going to read this one, okay? And you can argue about who wrote this. We don't know who wrote it. There's no evidence. But the voice is what you have to listen to, who's talking to you when this song's happening. And I think most scholars of this period, pre-modern Korean literature, would say this is a woman's song. I guess I can read it. We'll just drop out these little added-on pieces. These were just for the musical refrains to give the song melody. This was actually modified a bit. But anyway, do you leave? Do you leave me? Do you leave, forsaking me? How can you say to me, live on, and then leave, forsaking me? I would seize you, but I fear you would not soon return. Sad I will send you, love, but pray, Ergon, come back to me. What do we see here with this song? It kind of shows the situation of the Koryo dynasty. Koryo was a tumultuous time. We had a few invasions, 3 or 4 good-sized ones, the Jurchen, the Khiten, and of course the Mongols would be the 3 main ones that invaded. And when there's a war, what happens? The government comes around and they start taking men, Come on, let's go to war, let's go to war, let's go to war, let's go to war. It's not like you could say, no, I got a wife, I want to stay home with her. I don't think so. That doesn't work. You come. And so we have songs about separation, about women being left behind. What can they say? Well, they're pretty powerless. I think everyone was powerless at the time. It shows you that there's this sense of desire to keep this person with them, but there's also this strength in letting them go, I suppose. You know, when I picture this song, when I picture this woman singing the song to her loved one who's going off, I don't think she's crying and sobbing, oh, don't go, don't go. I don't see this at all. I find someone that's much stronger, someone that's able to strong up and say, okay, you've got to go, but come back. Come back to me. Don't get killed. That's what she's saying to him. And so this isn't a weak woman crying. She simply accepts reality. This is what happens. What are we going to do about it? Well, you got to go. Be safe. Hide. Ride with the general. Anyway, but there's a number of songs like this that show us. What's that?
Don't be a hero.
Yeah, don't be a hero. That's right. Don't be a hero. That's a bad idea. Yeah, don't be a hero at all. But there's a number of songs from Koryo, and there's not a great deal of these. There's about 20 in all that we have, but that can be attributed to women, and they show different things. I only picked one. This one talks about a separation. There are others that talk about things that are much more enjoyable. There's some that talk about sex and things like this, and from a woman's perspective, not from a man's perspective. So it's nice to see that there's different types of songs that do this. Shaman songs. Shaman songs are interesting, and this was one of my first fields that I really enjoyed doing. I don't do it anymore, but I did enjoy it for a while. Because they're written by women, no. Because they're composed by women, they're not written because they weren't written down into the 20th century. So the first shaman songs that were written down in the 1920s and in 1930s. So they were transmitted bits and pieces of all we have from the thing. But the motifs, the themes and whatnot that are in the songs reflect back much earlier times, of course. They're not 20th century reflections. Shaman songs constantly evolve, but the ones we have recorded in the 1920s, 1930s reflect 18th and 19th century Korea, not 1920s. Anyway, they reflect the hopes and frustrations of women in lower status groups, which makes sense because shamans were, of course, one of the 8 low-born classes of the Chosǒn Dynasty, so they were low-born. They didn't have any rights in that sense. They had the rights to pay taxes is what they had, but that was about it. So these were religious songs primarily, initially, but the religious nature of the songs kind of shifts, comes about the 17th century. I think scholarship says about the 17th century, 18th century, shamans stopped singing to the gods at their altar, and they turned around and started singing to their audience. And so in order to do that, they needed to create songs that were entertaining. Why did they do that? They did it for money. That's always the problem, money. They did it for money. They did it because they needed to entertain their audience or the audience wouldn't come to them. There are lots of shamans, but I can tell a good song. And that's the way that they were able to create these audiences and create longer narratives. The song I want to talk about is Pattid Gongju, or the 7th princess, the thrown away princess. She has lots of different names. She's Pattidegi. But Pattid Gongju is nicer because she's a princess, not a degi, right? But she has lots of different names. The song seems to be fairly old. There's bits and pieces of it that we can find in the Samguk Yusa, which dates back to the 13th century, supposedly covering stuff that was even older. So there's bits and pieces of this song around. We hear about it. People knew the song. But what's it about? It's about a woman, a child of the king and queen of Chosǒn who was, they couldn't have a son. They had daughter, 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 and number seven was the straw that broke the camel's back, right? And the king orders her to be thrown out. Get rid of her. Throw her out to the animals. Let the animals have her. I don't want her. Well, of course, the animals didn't hurt her because she's special, right? Isn't that how it always works? She's special. The animals protect her. Eventually, the Buddha finds her. And the Buddha picks her up and looks at her. And he says, well, if she was a boy, I'd take her for a student, but she's not. So he gave her to an old couple to raise. So even the Buddhist is biased. Even the Buddha turned into a Confucian by the 19th century in Korea, yeah? I don't think the Buddha said that at all. But anyway, so she grows up, and she's the type of person that we should all be. You taught her one thing, she learned 100. Wouldn't that be nice? Yeah, she was really smart. She grew up fast. And in the meantime, the king and the queen are struck down with an illness. They're going to die. Why are they going to die? Because they threw away their daughter. The gods don't like that sort of thing. And the only way they can live is if someone goes to Chosǒn, wherever that is, the next world, and gets the Pulsayak, the never-die medicine, right? Someone can go to the next world and get the medicine that'll keep you from dying, then you can be reborn. Well, they asked their daughters, they asked the court, they ask everybody, and everyone's got an excuse. I've got a bad knee. I've got a bad back. That's too far. I can't go that far. Well, the seventh princess comes home. She hears about this because she knows about things. She comes home, and she says, I'll go. I'll go to the next world. I'll get you the medicine. And she says, it's not because I owe you anything beyond that Mom gave me birth. I spent 10 months in my mother's womb. I'll go for that reason. So she goes to the next world. She gets the medicine. She has to get it from this huge monster that guards the spot. And anyway, she does it. She does it. She gets the medicine. She comes back. Her parents are already dead. They're getting ready to put them in the ground. She pours the medicine in their mouth. They wake up. They're good. They're alive. And her father is so happy. He says, Princess Pettid, I'll give you half my kingdom. And she says, I don't want your kingdom. I'm going to become a shaman. And that's what she does. And that's the end of the story. Well, you know, that's a pretty good story. And if you ever have the chance to see it, it's about 2.5, 3 hours when the shamans do it. It's quite a long story. And it's kind of like going to the opera, I suppose. I don't go to the opera, so I don't know if this is true. But everybody knows the story, right? You know what's going to happen in the opera. Well, the same with Pettid Gongju. Everybody knows the story. But it's kind of like you're on this roller coaster of emotions when you're listening to it. And you get to, Aigo! You get to do stuff like that at times. And you get to clap and you get to cry and these sort of things. And I think that's where people love the song, right? It had that ability to bring the audience in it. Well, what does it tell us about Chosǒn society? Well, I have a few things here. You know, this idea of male-child preference, that's pretty strong. Got to have a son. The inferior position of women, that's quite easily seen. How about the desire of women to do something beyond the house? In real life, in Chosǒn, a woman can't go into the royal court and say, I'll go to wherever and do whatever. They didn't have that status. They didn't have that ability. So it kind of is reflective of the desire of women to break beyond what they're allowed to do, to get out of there, to do something different. And finally, this rejection of the patriarchal system. Princess Pettid doesn't take half the kingdom. She doesn't want anything to do it. She's going to live in her own system. So it's an important song in that aspect. It kind of tells us that women were kind of fed up with some aspects of Confucianism. Pansori, we have a lot of Pansori. Maybe we don't have time to go into this in too much detail, but there's Pansori songs are the one-person dramatic story singing. It's much easier to say Pansori. But they show lots of, their composer groups of these, of course, are mixed. It's not one person. It's many people. There's many elements to these songs. And you can look at certain elements and say, well, this reflects women's lives. This reflects males' lives. And I picked two here. I picked Simchongga, not because I particularly like the song, but it shows a woman that's actually able to do something on her own. So she's able to marry, but she needs a man to get that done. That's not so good, right? She had to marry the emperor to get things to happen, right? So I don't find her to be a particularly great example of a woman with some sort of autonomy. On the other hand, Pyeonggang Sega, which is one of the oh, you know this one. I see. This isn't one of the more popular ones, I guess, or maybe it is one of the more popular ones. It's not. It's actually the text only survives in the written form, right? The song itself is gone, but it's a song that I remember being told when I was in graduate school that we couldn't read it because it was too nasty. It was too yahe. But actually, it's not. It's pretty. No, it's not nasty at all. It's just kind of funny, actually. It's very humorous. So I don't know where that came from. Probably the professor hadn't read it. That's my guess. But anyway, what's interesting about the song, it's not about Mr. Pyun. He's actually a no good guy. It's the woman that he chases after. And she has such a hard life. She marries men, and they die. And yeah, they all die. But it's not her fault. She was fated wrong. But when you think about the description of her, they say she's a beautiful woman, the most beautiful woman. So all the men want to marry her. And so it's kind of reducing the woman, blaming the woman for the fate of her husband. The woman doesn't make the men die. I mean, if it's fated and if it's in the stars, well, it's in the stars. But she's kicked out of her village because her husbands die when they marry her. But husbands keep wanting to marry her because she's beautiful. Now, whose fault's that? It's not her fault. She doesn't have any choice. She has no way to make money. She has no way to do anything. So she needs to marry in order to survive. Yet she's condemned for it. And she's actually the one that, when she marries Mr. Pyun here, and he is definitely no good, Mr. Pyun. He's lazy. He doesn't work. He gambles. He drinks. He womanizes even after he marries. He does all these bad things. But she's actually the one that holds the household together and manages the economy, if you would, of their little meager fortune there. And so she does a lot of good things. So I always like to look at this song as a representative of Pansori rather than Shimchongga or Chunhyanga or something like that. So anyway, we have that. I should keep moving here. I'm talking far too much. Literature in Hangul, we have poetic forms in prose. Sijo and Kasa are the most popular, what's this called? Verse, poetry. I'll get it out. These are the most popular forms here. And the songs that we have left, the majority of these songs, the greatest portion of them, a big portion of them, I'm not sure, I'd have to do my math, were written by Kisaeng. Kisaeng are female entertainers of the Chosǒn Koryo period. It's difficult to say where they come from. I have some possible explanations here. But at any rate, what's unique about them, or not necessarily unique, what's special about them is that they were educated. They were trained to write poetry. So they wrote poetry. Now, most of this was just crumpled up and thrown away, right? Because it was written by a woman. But not all of it. And so enough of it filtered down that we have quite a decent body of poems by these. And I want to actually play one for you now. Can we play one? Oh, there we go. Can I change slides? Before we play, can I change slides? I have it written for you. Oh, there we go. So you can actually read this. It's transcribed, it's in English, and it's in the Wonmun. This is how real Korean music sounds. It's not Sonyo Shide. Okay, this is the real stuff. If you'd like to dance, you're welcome to dance music. Takes a long time. The reason I like this is, yes? It's Sijo. Sijo. S-I-J-O. J. Yeah, Sijo. This is Chosǒn period. But probably, yeah, but the Sijo form itself probably existed in Koryo. And it was kind of not able to be written down really until you get into Chosǒn. They could write it in just Hanmun, in just Chinese characters. But they became very popular in the Chosǒn Dynasty because now all of a sudden you can write them down and sing them. And so upper status males and women would have Sijo parties where they would write and go ahead. Oh, because it's recorded. We have the scores.
So that they did very early scores as well.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, the Akchang Kasa is 15th century. It would be the first music book. So there's several music books. We have the scores, yes. So we know the song. So this is a traditional, the form. And most Sijo had the same rhythm in the sense. They followed this kind of, the rhythm was stock, I guess. And so you didn't have to, they're not a different song. Because basically the meter is going to be the same in all of your Sijo. The standard Sijo like this, they're going to have 3 lines and a certain number of feet or syllables to each line. And so that's, the music's going to stay the same. So
yeah. This form is a way of combining poetry and music. It's basically reciting poetry with music.
Yeah. Because
in the Western tradition, there is something called Recitativo, which goes like from late Middle Ages.
Okay. So similar sort of thing.
I'm a singer, and I took a Pansori course, and I commenced in classical. It's not easy, so that's what I'm saying.
Oh yeah.
What she's doing, and the embellishments are actually, if you would, not as much as the Pansori, which could be almost like a roadside, but it's still very skilled.
Oh, absolutely. This is the vocal style is something completely different than what we find today in Korean pop music. I mean, it's just as lost, unfortunately, because this is quite beautiful, but it's, well, no, they continue it wherever some people do. This woman did, but we're talking about a handful versus everybody else. Yeah, but but I suppose the aesthetic is lost as well. Because I play this for Korean classes, and they're running out to go to the restroom, right? They don't want to hear it. It's just torture. You're just like, oh, Professor Pettid, come on. It's just so much. But they don't appreciate the beauty of this anymore, I guess. And I suppose that's true for most people. Yes, please. No, it's poetry, but it's poetry that can be performed. So I guess that's the key with the Sijo is it's performed poetry. It's something historically Koreans have always loved to sing. And really, I mean, some of the first records we have of Korea written by Chinese are that Koreans like to sing and drink and dance. And some things never change. Because it's still that way, right? So but the performed literature, I mean, Sijo it became the most popular type of literature in the Chosǒn Dynasty because they could actually perform it. And so they could do this melody and sing and drink and write songs, write poems. Anyway, back to this one. What I like about it is that this is written supposedly by a woman. We don't really know this. Huang Jinyi is wasn't there a drama on her as well? Yeah, okay. Yeah, okay. See, that's what I'm missing right now watching TV. This is attributed to her, but it's difficult to know because a lot of things about her are speculative. Whether anything about her is speculative. A lot of poems are attributed to her that might not have been written by her, come later. But anyway, let's say it's written about her. because that adds to the story. And of course, there's a story behind this, as with any song. And basically, she has a man that she's trying to seduce, and she was very beautiful, so they say, and she enjoyed seducing men who didn't want to be seduced, like Buddhist monks that were 2 or 3 days from enlightenment. Well, I'll seduce him just for fun. These sort of things. Well, here she's talking to a man, and she's telling him, she is, of course, the one down here. Her name is Myeongwol. She's telling this man, don't be like this river and run off. Don't go away so fast. Don't go off to the ocean. Because once you go, you're not coming back. This is your only chance. And so she's making this comment. I mean, but there's a long story about this I really can't get into. But anyway, it shows us that she's not waiting for men. She's getting men. She is proactive, I suppose, in that sense. Anyway, she's an interesting one. But this is Sijo. So we have lots of Sijo like this. And I think for many, many years, scholars of pre-modern Korean literature would look at Sijo, would look at Kasa, would look at different writings and say they were written by men in a feminine voice. And I remember I was told this many times. Oh, no. It's a man writing it in a feminine voice. Well, why not a woman writing it in her own voice? And I think nowadays more and more people are looking at this for what it is. You know, why does that have to be written by a man? It was written by a woman, and we can accept that. This one, there's a little argument about. We'll skip this one. Kasa are longer songs, open-ended. Kasa can run 400 or 500 lines, so there's no set form. The form, there's a set form in the sense that each line has a certain meter to it, and it's generally in couplets. So 2 lines, 2 lines, 2 lines, 2 lines, 2 lines that have a certain meter to them, but it can go on and 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 on. So we don't translate Kasa very often because of that. But there's various themes to them. They're written by both men and women. They can focus on things such as travel. One of the most common things is travel. You'd go for some sort of trip with your husband, with your wife, whatever, and you'd write a Kasa about everything you saw on the trip. I think we have, what's his name, Chongchol wrote the one about Kumgangsan. Is a very famous Kasa about the beauty of the falls and everything there. So we have that. The one I'd like to look at briefly was written by Honan Soron, who is, she is one of the most famous women writers, I suppose, poets in Chosun. She was supremely talented. As a matter of fact, her poetry collection, written in Hanmun, in Chinese characters, was published in China. She was at that level of a writer. She was a great writer. She also wrote Kasa. And the Kasa that I have for her from here is Kuanga, the Song of the Women's Quarters. And it's not a very nice song because she didn't have a very good life. She with upper status, she married a man who wasn't a very good man at all. She had a horrible mother-in-law. She lost children through miscarriages. She had lots of problems. And we read her song, and we can kind of feel how she felt about this. This is just a piece of it, a little bit of it. She's talking about her husband, who's not around. At the Kisaeng house where men come in throngs, do you say a new one has come? Whenever the flowers blossomed or the sun set, he left home for no certain place. On a white steed and carrying a golden whip, where does he stay? Where? While not knowing how near or far he goes, how can I even hear news of him? Our fate is severed, yet still I think of him. Not seeing his face, why do I still yearn for him? It's long. The hours of the day are lengthy. The days of the month are wearisome. The plum blossoms in the garden, how many times have they scattered? When the winter night is bitter cold, thick snow falls too. When the summer night stretches long, what is this harsh rain about? Even the scenery of the peak of spring with blossoms and willow trees brings me no joy. When the autumn moon enters my room and crickets chirp by my bed, with a deep sigh and flowing tears, futilely I'm lost in many thoughts. It's difficult to bring this harsh life to end. She died when she was 27 years old. And she didn't die because she was anything but heartbroken. She had a miserable husband that treated her bad. And this is one of the last things she wrote. It's much longer than this. There's 4 or 5 other verses that I didn't include. But she talks about her life and her sense of powerlessness. She can't really do anything. She's educated. She's smart. She comes from an illustrious family. But she doesn't have anything to do. There's no way to reach out. And her one area where she can do things is in her poetry, in her poems, in her poetry. And so she writes. So she kind of reflects the other side of Chosǒn society, upper status woman in a bad situation. Again, marriages are made by families, and she's not able to have a son, so this is something that her mother-in-law blames on her, not her husband. Sad, huh? Oh, sorry. Yes. I know there is. I'm trying to think. I think it's Anthology of Pre-Modern Korean Literature by Peter Lee, published by University of Hawaii in 1981 or 84. Peter Lee, Peter H. Lee, Anthology of Pre-Modern Korean Literature from Ancient Times to the 19th Century, something like that. I think the whole poem's in there. If you want the Korean, you could probably find the Korean on Naver. I think you just go on the internet, it's there. I'm sure it's there. You could find the text in Korean. Oh, Anthology of Pre-Modern Korean Literature. Peter H. Lee. Not that one. Pretty much. Not all of them, but the standard Sijo, yes. It's not in that book. It's in his. That's the one from. No, it's the one from Hawaii. That's 81 or 84. It's his anthology. Yeah, that's just his. Yeah, the history. Yeah, the Sijo have the same rhythm for the most part. The standard Sijo. There are other type of Sijo that are a little bit different, but yeah, the bulk of them. It's.
They performed it recently. That was recorded recently.
Oh, that one? Yeah, definitely.
And, but it was performed in front of the people when it was written.
Yes. When they did the Sijo the first time, when they created them, they would sing them with the. It was probably a small group, not a big group, and then because the rhythm, the melody would be the same, so there wouldn't just new words would be plugged in, and so. A Sijo party, we'll go around the room and each of us write a Sijo and sing it while someone plays the komungo. Komungo. Yeah, I was going to say kayagun. Komungo. Yes?
But how, right, so she is an upper class and she's young, up to the 20s. How would her poems, how would they come out? How would they be known in China? How would she get?
Oh, her poetry was taken there by her brother. Her poetry in Chinese characters was taken there by her brother when he went as an envoy to China. So it was taken that way. The Kasa was preserved in her papers. It's not published in her lifetime. Yeah. These aren't published in Chosǒn. This wasn't published in Chosǒn. Yes,
So that was retained, but that was through her brother, because again, the status was that a woman is not to be heard outside the house, yet she was heard a country away.
she was heard. Yeah. Well, they were an odd family. Well, her brother was executed for treason. So, but they were a good family. Yes,
she was also very sympathetic toward the lower classes, not just women.
Oh, Nantoron.
Yeah.
I think so. Yeah.
And well, the whole family felt that way.
Well, their teacher was Idal, who was a soja, so not a full a person that couldn't be 100% into Yangban society. His mother was a secondary wife. So he was one of the great poets of Chosǒn Dynasty, but he was not of top status. So the brothers learned from Idal, and she did as well. She was in the same family. So yes, that's why their sympathy for these people was as it was. Very good point.
It's terrible that there's no biography of her, so little is known.
Yangi Chewol just did a book of her poems. It was on the desk in the library. Yeah, but I've been a few years since I've read it. But there's really nothing about her, is there? It's mostly about the poetry.
Very little about her.
Yeah. Well, the problem is I guess there probably isn't very much written about her, because due to the problems that her family had, her brother Hokyun was, like I said, he was executed for treason, whether or not he was trying to overthrow the state or not. But I think when that happens, the family itself was rather wiped out. So what was left was probably we were probably lucky to have that much left, I imagine, of it. Thank you.
What period?
17th century? I got to go back and look. Let me go back. Whoops, wrong way. 16th century, yeah. So we have that. So anyway, her writing then shows the other side of women's life. But the other kasa are also didactic kasa. They teach you how to do things. So there are kasa about what we do at certain times of the year. What kind of foods do we prepare? In the book I wrote on Korean food, one of my best sources was Kasa, to find out what kind of foods were being prepared for the seasonal holidays. So there's records. What do we prepare for Sol? What do we prepare for, I can't talk anymore, Daeboram, for these different periods? What do we prepare for these different holidays? And they'll tell you exactly what kind of foods they were preparing. It's quite enlightening to look at it in that way, to see exactly what was happening with these. So lots of different kasa. How are we doing here? Keep going? Okay. Let me talk about, I guess we won't get to the last part of it, but we can talk about prose writings, because they're pretty important too. And prose writings then are longer. Fiction writings, short novels, I suppose, is how they can be classified. And they were, in Korean history, in Korean literary history, for the most part, novels are not attributed. We don't know who wrote them. They're not signed. Why is that? Because the government frowned on novels. They didn't like the idea that someone could write a novel that would give some other reality to the people. It's not according to Confucianism, right? It's not didactic. You're letting people think outside the box. We don't do that. So Korean writers didn't sign their novels for the most part. So when we're looking at them, we have to figure out who wrote them. I translated this book right here, Unyongjong, The Tale of Unyong. I translated it from a Chinese character script. It was written in the 17th century. And from everything I read in Korea, all the secondary scholarship, they said it was written by a man. There was no question about it, because it's written in Hanmun. Women aren't smart enough to write in Hanmun, right? Yeah, that's, what's that? Oh, no. No. It's everything I read on this. Well, I first read it as a graduate student, and I didn't really think about it too much, because I was a graduate student. I had other things to think about. So I read it. Then a few years later, I was at Berkeley, and I found it in the library there again. And I was looking for a book project, and I was like, this is a great story. And I read it again, and I read it again, and I read it again. I read it a lot of times. And it became crystal clear to me that this wasn't written by a man at all. This was written by a woman. And that's what I said in as much in my book, that we have to acknowledge there's a possibility, at the very least, that this was written by a woman. Well, it's the voice. It's the worldview. It's so completely different than anything else we read about in Chosun literature from the 17th century. It's a romance, but it's unlike any other romance. The protagonist is a young woman. She's a palace woman. Her name is Unyong. She's different than the other palace girls. She's beautiful. She's smart, all these wonderful things, but she's not satisfied with being kept by the king and being forced to be this specimen, if you would, of his benevolence. So she's always feeling this distress, this hardship. One day a young man comes to the palace to write poetry with the Grand Prince. Actually, it's not the king, it's the Grand Prince, Anpyeong. And his name is Kim Chinsa. That's a position, so Scholar Kim. And as soon as, they look at each other, they, fall in love, of course. It's all it takes. It's just that glance. It's all she can think about is him and vice versa. The novel's told from her viewpoint. It's written in her viewpoint. She's the speaker. She's the narrator for the most part. And she tells about how horrible it is. She takes the initiative to meet up with this guy, to break all the rules, to get beyond the palace walls, to go out there to meet him, to send him a letter, to initiate a love affair. They talk about their love affair. The love affair is told from her perspective again. It's not talking about conquest like most of our romance novels from the 17th century talk about the male and how can I get this girl? That's what I'm looking for. It's not that at all. It's told from her sense of love, of romance. Anyway, of course, they're going to be discovered. You can't have a romance without a tragedy, right? And they are discovered at some level. And ultimately, she commits suicide rather than going back to her old life. I'm not doing the story justice by any means, but what's interesting about the story is that for years and years it said that a man wrote this. I think a woman wrote it. Whatever the case is, when we read the story, we see things about women's lives that men would have very little way of knowing. They couldn't know some of these things that they talk about. How they lived together within the palace, what they did, the troubles they had, the hardships they had being kept in the palace. Palace women, at any one time in the Chosǒn Dynasty, there were about 600 palace women. And they were not allowed to marry. They could only serve the king, right? Serve the royals. If they were lucky, maybe the king would look at them and take them as a concubine. I don't know if that's lucky or not. But anyway, that would have been their only outlet for their feelings. But most of these women didn't have that happen. And so they lived their lives in relative solitude and I imagine not very happy at all. Yes, well, that too. Yeah. And to make matters worse, they weren't even allowed to die at the royal palace. When they got old and ill, they were sent home to die. Nobody got to die at the palace except for the royals. Anyway, but these stories tell us a lot. I have a couple here, but this story is about the desire for romance, for love selected from one's own heart, not being told who you're going to be with. And it's about the tribulations here. The function of this novel, it was written in Hanmun, in Chinese characters originally in the 17th century, between 1607 and 1641. Within 30 years, it had been translated into Hangul. There are over 25 different versions of it, small variations, which tells us it was very widely circulated. Lots of people read this. Who read it? Women. Women read it. Because every woman in the Chosǒn Dynasty would have had similar feelings at some time. This idea that you're stuck in a marriage, you're stuck in a situation that's not of your choosing. We'll skip this. Should I keep babbling or let everyone have questions? Keep babbling? Okay, I can talk. I'm real good at that. There are other writings, non-literary writings that are really important. We have diaries. I give you two examples here. Pyeongja-ilgi was written by Lady Cho during the Manchu invasions of the 17th century. And the other one, of course, is Hanjung-nok, which was written by the wife of Crown Prince Sado, who was Cheongjo's father. So it's a great story, but we won't get into that now. The one that I find most interesting is the Pyeongja-ilgi, because this shows she's an upper status woman. They're refugees during the time of war. They're fleeing from the Manchus, basically. They're having a real hard time of it. But what do we see in her diary isn't this Confucian family where the man is Punechon, where the man's heaven and the woman's down here. This isn't happening at all. They're working together. They're working together, men and women, slaves, yangban, everyone's together trying to survive, and they're all doing things. And she details all this. She tells us what the weather is. It's snowing. We don't have anywhere to stay, so we all built this little lean-to on the side of the mountain, and we all stayed there for 2 days. We didn't have anything to eat. It's a wonderful diary to understand what people actually did in these times. You have to understand that there's so little that tells us what women did with their lives, so that's what makes this nice. So it's a very important work. Cookbooks, Umsik Dimibang, was written in the 17th century by a Lady Chang. And she wrote this as something to give to her daughters, to let them have, to learn how to cook. So, is cooking a good thing? Cooking's a great thing. And what makes it great is that it shows us how important it was for women to know how to do this correctly. Now, she was upper status. She's not in the kitchen cooking herself. She's directing the household. She's not doing this by herself. She may be cooking, but she's upper status. So it shows that it's important to manage all these things. What type of foods do we have in what sort of season? What can we do? There's 141 recipes in this book, and over 50 of them are concerning how to make liquor, 술. Why is 술 that important? Exactly. It's for hospitality. One of the main things that families did, when someone came over, you had to offer them some wine. You had to offer them some wine. You had to have varieties, different types. And so it was a way for a family to function properly within society, and liquor was a big part of it, and food. Instructional books, Kyuhap Chongso, Encyclopedia for Women's Daily Lives, 18th century. I'm translating this as we speak. This is even better yet. This is a book written by a upper status woman about how to run the household. And she talks about everything. When's the best time to plant green onions? Pa. And how do you fertilize pa when you plant them? She tells all this. And she's not talking as someone that's never been out in the garden. She's talking as a gardener. When do you put them in there? What kind of dong do you put there with them? What kind of dung do you put around them to get them to grow best? When do you harvest them? Different things like this. She talks about childbirth. She talks about medicine. She talks about how to get rid of ghosts. You've got to get rid of ghosts in your house. All these things. Sewing. So it's very important to understand what women actually did. She did a lot of things, and I don't think she was doing this because her husband told her to either. She did this to make her household successful, and that's what she did through this. But anyway, the book's very interesting. It's not very easy to translate, though. And scholarly writings. I think we can quit with this, and then you guys can give me questions. Yes, ma'am.
Lady Hyogong.
Haegyeong.
Excuse me, Hyogong. I cannot
Yeah.
pronounce Korean words.
It's okay. She was the one.
Word.
She's this one right here. Whoops. I just can't figure things out today. She wrote this right here, Hanjung-nok, The Diary of Sorrowful Days. I don't like it. She was a royal princess. She was her husband was the crown prince, so she was the crown princess, if that's the correct terminology. Her husband was executed by his father. I mean, it's a pretty tragic story what happened. But the book, her diary, what she wrote some 35 years after the fact and going on, is kind of, to me, and there's an excellent translation of it available, but it's kind of an excuse for everything that happened in her life. When I read it, I just read it, she's making excuses on these things for her family, for her father, not her father-in-law, she's not, for her own family. Her own family. Yeah, because her own family was victimized. They had pretty much all been killed off by the time she wrote this in 1795. Well, because they couldn't. Yeah, so when I read it, it's kind of, you have to take it all with a grain of salt. Yeah, but I mean it's interesting but it's, again, I mean she's got a purpose for writing that, so that's what you always got to. I'm sorry. Well, as a royal. Probably, I think so. I mean, there are other women that wrote things, but I mean, most of the royals wouldn't have had any purpose for writing a book like that, I would guess. I don't think so. I don't think they would have had anything to say. I mean, there are books that we could argue that might have been written. I had one somewhere in here that may have been written by someone in the royal family, and the one that I think it is the Konbom, which is a book for understanding Confucianism. It was obviously written by someone that's very well educated and with good understanding of Confucianism. It could have been written by a royal, but they didn't put their name on it. For the Hanjung-nok, for the record of sorrowful diary of sorrowful days, she specifically wrote it for her nephew, who was going to be king, right, Sijo, as a way to inform him about his grandfather, who he never knew and who no one had been able to speak about, right? Because Chongzhou, right, grandson is Sunjo, right?
So that he would actually absolve her brothers and nephews.
Well, that was the
from
hope,
when
right?
That was the hope, to restore the family to honor.
Yeah, because they weren't able to speak about this, right? And so it was a way to, kind of get this out there. But sure, go ahead.
What nephew? I mean, whose nephew was he?
Hers.
Hers? Who
Yeah.
was her brother?
Yeah. Well, I mean, they're all in the same family. He's going to be king. Hong.
Grandson that was going
Right.
to be king.
Grandson is going to be,
King.
yeah, Chongzhou, Sunjo.
It was her
Sunjo.
grandson, because she
Yeah.
never actually made it to a dowager status.
No,
She
no,
was
she didn't.
left as a crown princess.
Yes, she was. Yeah, it was Chongsun was the dowager when Sunjo became king. So, no, she wasn't a dowager.
She never became, because of her. She was almost essentially stripped as his mother. Her son was almost adopted by her dead brother-in-law.
Mm.
It's this crazy. You got to read the whole intro to see how
a long
the
book.
whole. It's a very long book.
But that said, I think there are other books that are more important than that one, I guess. Yeah, well, I think something like this that talks about the education of women, how you interact with Confucianism and stuff as an upper status woman is probably something more practical, and it touched more lives than her diary would have. Her diary would have not been circulated at all. No, definitely not. Not at that time.
How many royal women ever reached down to lower level women? I mean, did they have any connection or?
Well, it's hard to say because we don't necessarily have the records. We don't know. I mean, was there relationships between the royal, the queens, the princesses, and the palace ladies, for example, who would have been lower status? We don't really know because there's no record of that. No one wrote anything down. So it's difficult to say.
Of Chosǒn Dynasty, no?
No, they don't talk about that. They talk about men. That's what they care about. So I think I can quit here, and you can ask more questions. I didn't get to the third part about the women's economic activities. I'll talk about women's economic activities then. All right.
I have a question because
Yes, sir. Go ahead.
we read these stories and kind of approach them from the 21st century perspective. And although some of the stories we know from the writings of women seem to be not very happy ones, and yet women somehow found themselves in this in the whole structure of the society, and probably played, even in many cases, quite a powerful roles.
Definitely.
So maybe you could elaborate a
Oh,
little bit on
women had, I think this is where the economic activities come in. I think far too much emphasis has been placed on Confucianism when you talk about the Chosǒn Dynasty. Confucianism was this pipe dream. It was this ideology. It was this aim. But practicalities said that we need to have something to eat. We need to be a successful country, particularly after the Hideyoshi invasions of 1592 to 98 and the Manchu invasions of 1628 and 1636. Chosǒn society was moving in another direction. It had moved away from this idea of Confucianism as something that was abstract and trying to apply it to society. We get into the period where we start to have the thinkers that are now called Shidduch scholars, the pragmatists, where they started to come up with new ideas of looking at the world and ways to go in different ways to move the country forward. And women were a part of this as well. And Confucianism becomes not this Confucianism where you're debating about things that are abstract like I and Ki. The big debate, of course, in the Chosǒn Dynasty was Igidon, the debate over the primacy of principle or matter. It's a chicken and the egg argument, right? It doesn't really matter because you can't touch either one of them. They're just nothing. But Confucianism moved beyond this, and now it's moving to practical means of how society is going to run. And when we focus on economics, when we focus on how people lived, all of a sudden we can see that this idea that women were underneath men isn't true. Can't be true. Because if you're running a household, the woman's input is every bit as important as the man's input. Now, upper status is a little different because you have servants, slaves, and whatnot. But when we're talking about the bulk of the population, these ideas of Confucianism had nothing to do with it at all. It was about survival. And how did you survive? By operating your farm better, by selling something that someone else didn't have. It was money. And I'm not saying it's capitalism, because I don't think it would have moved necessarily towards capitalism, but it was about, in some ways, economic growth and building the country. So I think this is the part that's been kind of overlooked when we talk about Confucianism, when we talk about the Chosǒn Dynasty. So I can probably skip this. Well,
in the lower classes, the women were more empowered?
Well, yeah, I think so. I think so because
that's true.
Well,
all societies,
but it's at different levels, I suppose. Women were very empowered in the upper status groups as well. So I don't think it was just the lower status women. It was just in a different way. In the lower status families, I suppose they were empowered because of their physical labor, perhaps, or their smarts. But with the upper status women, it's the same way. It's not necessarily their physical labor, but it's their ability to manage their household, to manage their fortune. And this was their job, essentially. So the man was supposed to get into government service, was supposed to become a high-ranking official. Maybe he couldn't, because by the time we get to the 17th, 18th century, there's far too many men with degrees and not enough government jobs. So there was nowhere for him to go. So who's going to take care of the household? The woman. The man doesn't have anything to do. Sit around and read books all day. That's not going to put any food on the table. So this is what happens. Just briefly, we have this idea. I'm not going to talk about this because I already did. We have this idea that in Korean history that men farm and women weave. 남경 요직. But this isn't true either. Both did both. Women farmed just as men did. And how do I know that? We have paintings. Isn't that wonderful? People painted pictures, and we have the pictures. They show us that women farmed. They show us that men weaved, too. So we have people doing things like this. This is Kisaeng. This is your typical work, woman's work of weaving. But I'm going to come back. But we also have, come on, here we go, women gathering greens, women working in the farms and things like this. So we have different areas where women are being productive. In Korea, as you know, or as you should know, or as you might know, is a very mountainous country. And a lot of the foodstuffs that we find on the table are not cultivated, they're gathered. Somebody has to go up in the mountains and get the suk, or the whatever. They have different types of, all the different things. So they have to go up there and do this. So there's a great amount of knowledge that's associated with doing this as well. If you've ever been out picking mushrooms, you would know that that's dangerous if you don't know what you're doing. You don't want to get the wrong mushroom. Well, the women in the Chosǒn Dynasty knew what they were doing. They knew about these things, so they contributed to the house like this. I think the point I really wanted to make, it's far too complicated. I'll tell you one more story. I'll tell you one more story and then I'll quit, okay? I have to read this from here, though. That's not it. Here we go. Here we go. This is the story I want to talk about. Of the wise daughter-in-law of the poor family who was successful in the family business. Here we go. We're talking about a really good girl here. This is recorded in an unofficial history. This is called a yadam, or yasa. These are basically little accounts that are written down, collected, and circulated. I don't know, what is it? What do they call that now? An urban legend, I suppose, perhaps. Anyway, this tells of this girl. They were a very poor family, but the daughter-in-law, she got up every morning and went out and sold kamcho. Kamcho is licorice root. It's used for, if you have a sore throat If you have a cold, you boil it and you drink it. It's good for everything. Yeah, it gets rid of the flu too. Yeah, it's wonderful stuff. Anyway, she knew where to find the roots. She'd dig it up off the mountain, and then she took it into town and she sold it. And she made money, and the family became very, very successful. And what did they finally start calling her? They started calling her a hyunbu, a wise daughter-in-law. And she was termed this by the local magistrate. Why is that important? This is a term that's reserved up until the 17th century, the 16th century, for the Confucian woman, the woman that didn't remarry after her husband died, the woman that served her in-laws when they were ill or something, that did something like that. This was the highest acclaim that one could give a daughter. You're hyunbu. You're a wise, in a Confucian sense, daughter-in-law. But by the time this comes out in the 18th century, we're now applying it to the woman that can make a fortune. So we can see how society's changed. It's changed in some ways. Perhaps it's reflective of the realities of society before that, but it's not serving your in-laws with tea or with food. It's serving them with wealth, with providing for them. And the daughter could do this. The daughter-in-law could do this where no one else could. And so that's where she got this title from. And so we see this written by the magistrate of the village. He writes this and puts this thing that she's the wise daughter-in-law that could accumulate a fortune. Is the story true? Who knows? But anyway, I think there's lots of them out there that probably do the same thing, that show these same sort of relations. The part that I didn't cover very well today is the part about the economic activities. But that's, it's this other aspect of Confucianism. It's the elephant in the room, if you would, that we have to think about society in a broader sense. Confucianism was important, but so were other things. And it wasn't strictly one thing, I guess, instead of the other. So I can do questions.
For question, we would like to wait for microphone because we are recording this event and we need to record the question as well.
I got lots of answers.
I read somewhere in my studies I'm interested in similarities, differences of the three Far Eastern cultures, Chinese, Korean, and Japanese. And I came across at some point this idea that the status and the amount of freedoms of women which they had in each of those society can be reflects itself in the type of clothing that wear. And the implication was that Korean women wore very loose, comfortable clothing which allowed them to move, while the Chinese and Japanese women were very restricted in it. So how...
No, that's an excellent point. I mean, not only that, if you think about upper status Chinese women with the feet binding, that sort of thing, I mean, that's obviously China was such a strong patriarchal system they could get away with that. I tell my students Korean women would never put up with that. They wouldn't allow that to happen. I mean, they would say, nonsense, you're not doing that to my feet, do it to your own foot. I really believe that wouldn't have happened. But yes, the clothing that Koreans wore, especially commoner, not necessarily the elites, but the ones below this, it allowed them to work, the freedom of movement. The other reason for that, of course, is that Koreans were on the floor and Chinese were on chairs. That's part of it too. But it reflects a different culture. Yeah, absolutely. That's a good point. Very good. So I agree. I think the clothing does reflect that, absolutely.
Did Shilhak scholars change the course of the women's lives a little bit?
No. The problem with the Shilhak scholars or the pragmatists is that they really didn't change much of anything because they were out of power. They weren't successful. The status quo was too strong, and so they really weren't able to overturn it. And after the death of Chongzhou in 1800, then the Chosǒn Dynasty is on this 110-year slide to the end, right? So it was kind of too late. Did they change things for women? Hard to say. But I think what happened is that the emphasis on being pragmatic, being practical, did have real changes for most of Chosǒn society. But if they had started 100 years earlier, it would have been better. I suppose.
Is there any evidence of common women remarrying? I know you said that they got.
Oh, yeah.
There was an indication. You said that they found ways to get around it.
Tons. The custom of carrying a woman off on your shoulder. the taking a woman off. It was kind of the problem with this idea of not remarrying, and they tried to enforce this throughout society. They tried to make it something that no status group woman would remarry. It was a terrible thing. But the problem is that marriages could start as young, 10, 11 for the woman. I mean, they weren't actual marriages at that point. They were labor arrangements. You send your daughter over there so she could work for 4 or 5 years in the kitchen, and then she can marry the boy, something like that. But think about this. You start a marriage, and say you get married, a girl gets married when she's 14, and her husband dies when she's 18. So now she's going to live to be 60 some odd years old, because women live a long time. She's going to live to be a long time. She represents a lot of things here. In a common status family, the thing she represents more than anything is a mouth to feed. And that is, it's someone they have to take care of that doesn't necessarily contribute that much to the family. And also there's this sense of pity. The women folk, the men folk in that family look at this poor girl, she's 18 and she's going to live the rest of her life like this. That's horrible. And so what they did is they kind of let her get kidnapped. There'd be some boy in town that'd catch her eye, and there'd be that spark, and they'd, I'm not going to lock my gate tonight, and don't come over now. And sure enough, he'd come over and kidnap her, take her away. They'd report it to the government, and the government may, okay. Yep. Happened all the time.
Yeah, but that's not always that it was consensual, because again, it could be that they caused spark, but it could be also that she's passed on to somebody else.
Oh, I don't think that was the case. I really think these were beyond the reach of the law. I mean, these were kind of extra legal marriages. They were situations where both parties had to want to do it. Generally, the guy would have been a widower or something as well. And they would simply move to another village. You have to remember that there was very little mobility in terms of space in the Chosǒn Dynasty. You had to wear tags that put you in a certain place. So to let someone actually go up and leave was very difficult to do. There's an interesting song that I didn't talk about, and if I can remember it, it's Ten Dori Omma. It's a song about the burnt boy's mom. He was burnt, so he was called, the burnt boy in Omma, right? And it talks about this woman. This was written in the 19th century, and she had 5 marriages. She tells about all of her different marriages that she had, and she's telling what happened with each of the married. Oh, this guy died. This guy was too greedy. These different things, but she just cites all these different marriages. And the other women. This is a poem, by the way. And the other women around her are enjoying this and adding in that they've been remarried, they did things. So no, I think it was fairly widespread, and I think it was consensual. I don't think it was, I'm sure there are cases when it wasn't, but I think for the most part, this custom anyway of obukayo is just, wink, wink, take her away.
But this wouldn't happen in China or Japan?
I don't. I'm afraid I can't speak intelligently about China or Japan. It's really not my field, but China is a huge country. Again, we can't talk about China with this, I mean, what part of China, what group. So I think it probably happened in China. And Japan was a lot looser. Remember, Japan never had the Confucian type situation that Korea had. So I think that Japan probably had this type of thing going on for a long time. Yes, you have to wait. Everyone wants a microphone.
You said that women learned about Confucianism and used it their advantages throughout the dynasty. So I heard today, everything like negative side. That's a whole reflection. So, what kind of advantages or, what kind of good side they...
About Confucianism?
Yeah, yes.
Well,
for women.
For women?
Yeah, for women.
Well, it's
so
not...
only upper,
Yeah, this is only the upper status women, but I mean, before you have to understand the social situation you're in. And if women didn't, if the only place they were getting knowledge about Confucianism was from their husband or their father, then they're at a disadvantage because they don't actually know what Chuxi said in his 4 books, right? They don't know what he said. So the importance of these educational books that were written by women about Confucian texts actually talk about what the text is actually about. Now, does that give the women status or something? Not necessarily, but it gives them ammunition if they want to debate about Confucianism. And we actually had women in the Chosǒn Dynasty that were Confucian philosophers, that wrote about Confucian philosophy, just like Tege or Yi or any of these people. So the same sort of thing. They were Confucian philosophers. They wanted to study it. They thought that they could reach the same level as these men. So their aim was the same as their husbands, sagehood, to become a perfect Confucian person.
Low-class women are like
low-class
Shaman
women. Yeah.
Shaman songs, Pansori, like that, all, reject.
Oh, yeah.
Kind of,
yeah, definitely.
But
even in rejecting, they have to understand it, I think. And so, the lower status would understand the basic ideas of Confucianism. So I talked about Princess Padi Gongju. What is its critique on Confucianism? Well, of course, it's this male child preference. But it's also a critique of the males in society. Because who's supposed to go off and take care of the king? The ministers. This is the samgang, the 3 bonds. It's loyalty, it's filial piety, these things. But they're not doing them. It's only this princess that's outside of the system that does it. So she's criticizing the other people by what they're not doing. They're hypocrites. They're talking about Confucianism. You're not doing it. Why aren't you going? My elder sister should take care of her father. Not me, the youngest. The men of the court should take care of him. But they're not doing it, so I'll do it. So I think you see the critique in that way. But I don't know if I answered your question or not, but I enjoyed talking about it.
We'll end there. Let's give another round of applause to Professor Pettid.
Thanks for listening.
Again, Professor Pettid, we'd like to thank you for your wonderful lecture. I certainly learned a lot. And we'd like to remind everybody that on June 6th, we're having the last Korean Depth lecture, a Buddhist nun's experience. Sunjun Sunim. She's one of the first Korean nuns to graduate from a Korean monastic college. She'll be coming to share her experiences. And the following day, we'll have a conference and for teachers. But if you have any questions about it, you can ask us later. So, and again, thank you, Professor Pettid, and have a good evening.
Thanks for having me.
From what I know,